Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Cadman. I work for Action Sustainability in the Supply Chain Sustainability School. If you've been watching any of the other Lunch and Learns or Business Bites this week and in previous weeks, you'll recognise my dulcet tones. Apologies, my voice is a little bit croaky today from doing lots of webinars, but we'll take you through the next hour talking about carbon reporting. So this builds on the previous Lunch and Learns we've done on scope busting yesterday and on climate change and carbon on Monday, and other workshops and business bites that you might have attended in the last few weeks. And obviously the time is now. It is COP26. I'm sure you're getting updates through your various media channels on what's going on up in Glasgow, and it's good to see that there is some progress, that we're just looking for the action behind the words now, essentially. So I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get started. I'll just move a few boxes around. Great. So we've got 100 participants. That's a good number. We shall make a start. So usual house rules, which you'll be familiar with if you've come on any of these before. Your cameras and mics are off, but there is the Q&A box function if you want to post a question to me. If you look at your bar in Zoom, you'll see there's kind of 2 speech bubbles with Q&A written underneath those. If you can use that to post any questions, I plan to have a look at those at the end rather than throughout. So post a question, I will try my best to get around to them at the end. We will be looking for your feedback at the end. My colleague Sophie will be sharing a link to a simple and short feedback form. It's always good to know your feedback, what we're doing well, what we could do better, continual improvement and all that, and also importantly, what other topics you'd like to hear about from the Supply Chain School. Do take notes if you want to, but we will be sharing the slides as a PDF afterwards. Likewise, we're going to record this session and share the link to that. So if you or colleagues want to look back at this later on, then please do. There is quite a lot of information in this hour, so don't be worried if you don't take it all in. There's quite a bit there, so that's why we share the slides and why we share the link as well, so you can refer back to it as a resource in and of itself. Okay. Get the right page. So, quick overview of what I'm going to take you through over the next hour. Essentially, why are we reporting on carbon? Just a very brief touch at some of the background of it. If you've been on any of these before, you'll recognise some of the slides, but I want to be inclusive for anyone else who's come along to this in and of itself to get everyone on the same page. Then a quick brief look at where carbon emissions come from. And this is important because it gets us into the mindset of reporting. In order to be able to report on our carbon emissions, we need to know where they're coming from, what's producing them, and what we can do about them, importantly. A brief look at the response globally and from the UK, and then the detail of how we report. And I've covered some of the main reporting mechanisms, some legislative, some voluntary. It isn't exhaustive by any means, because it would be more than a 1-hour lunch and learn if it was. We'd have to do a lot longer session, but some of the main ones that you're likely to face. And then some information about where we get the data from. So again, this all goes together. It's not just a case of knowing how that piece of legislation works on reporting for carbon, but importantly, where you go to get your data from, who you get it from, and how you analyze it. So there's a bit of a jargon explanation as well. If you're on the scope busting one yesterday, you'll recognise some of it, and hopefully it'll help you revise some of that if you're looking for that. So why are we reporting on carbon? This is a slide I show many times. It very clearly states that there's a rise in the global average temperature for the whole world of about 1.1 degrees Celsius. This has been measured with observatories around the world. It's not fictitious, and you can see that that trend is basically upwards, and that's as a consequence of us emitting more greenhouse gases. So if we're looking to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius above those pre-industrial levels, we've got to start bending that curve back down very soon. What does that look like in the last few years? What's the outcome of that increased temperature, the increased energy? Essentially, there's more energy in the system. It's like a box and you're heating it up. Where's that energy going to go? It's got to come out somewhere. Eventually, that energy has to be released. And all those weather events that we see in the news are only increasing. Climate change is a multiplier. It's more frequent. It's more extreme. Recent reports about Madagascar being potentially the first famine situation, the first starvation situation that is purely caused by climate change. There's no war, there's no civil war, no other kind of political issues going on of any significance. The lack of rain has been attributed purely to the changes in the weather patterns and the long-term climate change trend in that part of the world. So they're seeing a lot of problems there with lack of rainfall, and obviously leads on to food and crops and so on. So where do greenhouse gas emissions come from? There's 6 or 7, depending on how you count it, key greenhouse gases. And again, this is important for the reporting, knowing that you're not just focusing on carbon dioxide, which comes from the combustion of different materials, but there's many other sources as well. Methane is a big source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide on a 100-year basis. And indeed, at COP this week, many countries have signed a pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% in the coming few years. It's the kind of the hidden greenhouse gas that a lot of people don't realize is important. CO2 is everywhere. Anything you burn, whether it's in a vehicle, in plant and equipment, or in a boiler, that's quite obvious. Methane is less obvious, whether it's agriculture, whether it's from anaerobic biodegradation and other sources as well. And then some of the even less common gases, but as you go down this list, they get more and more potent. Their impact is a lot higher. Nitrous oxide is a key one. It can be used as a propellant gas in industry. It's harmless to us, and indeed it's used as an anaesthetic, of course, in dentistry, in midwifery, and in other uses as well. So it's a great compound, but it has huge impacts on the environment. So we need to be aware of this. Wastewater treatment works have to deal with N2O as well. Don't get nitrous oxide confused with NO2, shifting the 2 to the right one space. NO2, nitrogen dioxide, is an air quality pollutant, and that's what affects people's health. So very similar, but very different in what they do in terms of their impact on us and the environment. Sulfur hexafluoride is used as a gas to reduce the risk of fire in high voltage switchgear. And then you get 2 groups of compounds, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons, which are used in air conditioning systems and other systems like heat pumps, where you're going to get an exchange of heat between one system and another system. But again, great at what they do, but can have detrimental effects if they are not controlled properly. And those 6, I'll come on to NF3 in a minute, those 6 are the basket of 6 greenhouse gases, and those are the ones that we will be reporting on when we come to report, whether it's the streamlined energy and carbon reporting or one of the others that I'm going to talk about. They're the focus. It's not just carbon dioxide, albeit that's the most prevalent. NF3 is included when they updated the Kyoto Protocol, nitrogen trifluoride. That's used in some specialist high-tech industries, whether it's LCD manufacture and electronics and so on, but it's there as part of that issue as well. It's these that get the focus, that if we're going to reduce our emissions and stay within a 1.5 degree scenario, that's where we need to make our efforts. The emissions, where do they come from in terms of sectors? A lot of it is from the direct consumption of energy, burning of fossil fuels, and you can see that's pretty much 3/4 of the pie chart, and that's broken down whether it's industry, whether it's buildings, whether it's transport, as you can see on the pie chart in front of you. But importantly, those other sectors as well. Agriculture I've mentioned already in terms of methane and N2O, waste production, there's F gases in there as well. Also industries emitting greenhouse gases in and of themselves through their own production processes, as well as the energy they consume. So what this says to me is that everyone has their part to play. Every sector has its part to play. There's no one sector that is more culpable than another. So obviously we're in the first week of COP26. This story goes back a long way. It goes back to 1987 at least, with the Brundtland Report and the definition of sustainable development, and all the meetings that we've had since then, whether they're at Rio, Kyoto, or more recently in Paris. There's been a long journey towards this. We're on COP26. That essentially means the 26th meeting of the Conference of Parties. It's been going on for 26 years. But you can go back further than that. You can go back to Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. You can pick up many different bits along the way that say we are aware of what we are doing to our planet, and we need to address this. But if we don't know what we're doing now, we don't know what our baseline is, we can't manage that going forward, and that's where reporting comes in. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And this was kind of rubber stamped in effect by the IPCC report in August, that basically said, look, we need to get on with this. And they gave a lot of the evidence, not so much the actions to reduce it, but the evidence to say, if we stay to a 1.5 degree scenario, this is the kind of damage or change we might see, but it will be worse if it's 2 degrees or 2.5, 3 degrees. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has got a very important role to play in all of this. And in terms of reporting, we're all reporting for the reason of trying to reduce our emissions. And what this graph is showing us, that along the horizontal, you've got the timeline from 1990 to 2100. And up the left-hand side, you've got the emissions global emissions of greenhouse gases. So that's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all those others I showed you alongside the pictures of cows and squirty cans of cream. So what we're looking at here is about 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases being emitted annually currently. And if we just carry on that trajectory going up, you can see what that scenario might look like in the pink, where we have a 4 to 5 degree warming scenario and all the impacts that come from that. And then various different scenarios as you bring it down, as we have some policies, current policies, we have more pledges and targets, and then ideally we bring it down to a 1.5 degree scenario, and we bend that curve of emissions down. But again, we're only going to be able to do that if we understand where we're at now and we're measuring and reporting on what we are doing and how we're reducing that. The red line is at 2050 because that's where the UK's Climate Change Act and many others around the world have set their net zero target by. And the net zero piece is important in this, kind of a bit of a jargon here on what net zero means. You'll see there's a gap between the zero on the horizontal axis and the green line for 1.5 degrees. If my cursor, if you can see my cursor, it's that little bit there. That's the net zero piece, because we haven't decarbonized everything. There are still some carbon emissions, some greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to balance those off by removing greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere, by compensating and removing them. So that's why it's net zero, not absolute zero. And as I mentioned, the UK has a Climate Change Act. And again, the reporting all feeds into this to reduce our emissions by 100% net, 100% by 2050. And that's what that dotted purple line is telling us. The black solid line is what we've done already since 1990, and the purple line is where we need to go from there. Scotland and Wales have a slightly different target because of the devolved administrations, and that's what they do, and they need to do that, and that's good. But also they have different economies as well in comparison to England and the rest of the UK. The Republic has its own targets, similarly, net zero by 2050. And then there's an intermediate target in 2035 of reducing our emissions by 78% by 2035 compared to the 1990 baseline. And the only way we're going to know whether we've hit that is if organisations report. So that's what we need to get into. Linked to that as well, the Procurement Policy Note, PPN 0621, came out in June this year. This is again driving reporting, driving measurement. So any central government department procurement that's over £5 million per year, not including VAT, will come under this. And it stipulates that the project needs to have a carbon reduction plan that aligns to the net zero targets for the UK. And that will get cascaded down through procurement and contracts, undoubtedly. So that is another driver for measuring what you've got and reporting it. So some fundamentals, and apologies to those of you who came on my scope busting lunch and learn yesterday. You'll have seen this already, but it's important to know what some of these key terminologies mean if we're going to do reporting, because reporting is all full of jargon, I'm afraid. You're going to have to get your heads around it if you're going to be reporting against the various different mechanisms. So this picture is taken from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 supply chain standard. And it talks about two different kinds of emissions, or three, depending on how you look at it. There are direct emissions, those that you control or own yourself and your organization, and those are your Scope 1 emissions. You can see that kind of greenish arrow going up in the middle with Scope 1 written on it. So that's your own vehicles, your own plant and equipment, your own boilers, your own fugitive emissions as well. If you have HVAC that's got a bit of a leak, if you have a chemical process that emits greenhouse gases as well, that's part of your Scope 1. All the other emissions, obviously, are indirect emissions. That's where essentially you're paying somebody else for a service or some products or some materials. They're hived off into two different buckets. Scope 2 is essentially your electricity. You're paying an energy provider for that, and that goes into Scope 2. Whereas everything else is Scope 3, and that's largely summarizes your supply chain. It's a bit more than that, but it's primarily your supply chain. So you can see in that curly kind of purple arrow going round, it's your business travel, your commuting, the products, goods and services that you buy in, particularly any waste generated in your processes. If you've got third-party transport and distribution as well. So all those things are part of your supply chain. So knowing what Scopes 1, 2 and 3 means is really crucial for when you come to do the reporting, because they won't give you that explanation. They'll assume that you know what Scope 2 means or Scope 3 means when you get there. There's something else important as well in terms of how things are comparable. I mentioned earlier that methane is about 25 times more potent than CO2, kilo for kilo. And you can see the relative numbers there. This is a bit like converting euros to pounds or dollars to pounds. It's an exchange rate mechanism. We've notionally said that CO2 has an impact of 1. There are no units with it. It's for every ton of CO2, the impact is 1, and then you can measure the others relatively. And that's allowing you to convert and make it comparable. And this is what the little e means when you see tons of CO2e or kilograms of CO2e. The E means equivalent. So if I took, for example, SF6, if I had a 1 kilo leakage of SF6, sulfhexafluoride, that's like emitting 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So you do that conversion, and then you can report all your data in tons of CO2 equivalent, rather than reporting a line for CO2, one for methane, one for nitrous oxide, and all the way down. It allows you to represent it all in pounds sterling, rather than dollars and euros and Hungarian forints and whatever else you want to pick. So how should we report our carbon? I'm going to take you through 4 key mechanisms. Like I said earlier, there are others. There are many of them, and these are the ones that are relevant in the UK. I'm not going to touch upon any others that are relevant outside of the UK, but these are the main 4 as we see it. One that sometimes crops up that people mention is the emissions trading scheme. That is something that we will pick up on another session, because it's relevant only to a few large, very intensive energy using sectors. It's not as applicable as broadly. But anyway, we're going to focus on these 4. 2 legislative and 3 voluntary. The legislative mechanisms are the Streamlined Energy Carbon and Reporting Mechanism, and the Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme, SECA and ESOS. Some people call it SCCR, some people call it SECA. And then some voluntary schemes as well. The Carbon Disclosure Project, now formerly known as CDP, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and the Supply Chain Schools Climate Action Group. Some of you might have been on the SBT Lunch and Learn we did a couple of weeks ago when Owen Smith came along and talked about what the SBT is. So if you're on that, that's really good. If you weren't on that, do search the school's website and you'll hopefully be able to find the link to the Lunch and Learn that Owen ran for us on more of the detail of what SBT is about. Okay, so the first one is streamlined energy and carbon reporting. As I mentioned at the top, there's quite a lot of information here, so don't worry about if you don't quite catch some of the detail. These slides will be shared, as will the link to the recording. But I just want to take you through an overview and then give you the link to where you can find out more information, essentially. SECR came into force over 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. It replaced the much maligned carbon reduction commitment, and gladly, the CRC was quite tortuous, having been involved in gathering data and verifying data according to the arcane rules that were provided by central government on that. It is streamlined, it's a lot more straightforward now. The next paragraph talks to you about the qualification to be involved in it. So all quoted companies, anyone who's stock listed is involved. So whether it's the London Stock Exchange, the European equivalent, the New York or the NASDAQ, you have to report. And this builds on what was already in existence called the mandatory GHG reporting requirements that went in the director's report. But what's interesting now is that SECR also includes large unquoted companies. So you could be a private limited company, but still be included if you meet the criteria for being a large business. And that's essentially not an SME. So I'm sure you'll recognize some of the figures there, that if you've got more than 250 employees, or you've got a turnover of greater than 36 million pounds, you will be included in this. And that 36 million as well, you might recognise from the Modern Slavery Act as well. It's the same threshold for your turnover for inclusion in the Modern Slavery Act in terms of having to publish your statement about your modern slavery policy. So if you qualify for 2 or 3 of those criteria, you're in. And this is for your business and your business only. There's kind of no parent company issue here in the way that there was for the carbon reduction commitment. What it covers is your scopes 1 and 2. Which is why it's important to know what scope 1 and 2 mean from your activities that you're in control of, that you're responsible for. So it's UK based if you're a large unquoted company. If you're a quoted company, then it's your global operations. So there's that distinction there between a global business a quoted business will be looking at their global emissions, but conversely, an unquoted business will look at its UK exposure. Scope 3 is very much recommended, but not mandatory, except for the business travel aspect that you can see on the screen there. So it's very much encouraged because in many cases, the Scope 3 impact from an organisation will far outweigh your Scope 1 and 2. But if every organisation is reporting Scope 1 and 2, we're building up a bigger picture of what's going on and being able to therefore track how it's being brought down in terms of what you can control and own directly. You also have to include your underlying energy use. So it's not just the tons of CO2 or greenhouse gas equivalents, it's also the underlying energy use in kilowatt hours. So some of that will come directly and fairly easily. Your electricity, for example, will be quoted in megawatt hours or kilowatt hours as well as the CO2, but other different forms of fuel won't necessarily be in the same situation. So you need to be prepared to convert litres or gallons of fuel X into kilowatt hours as well. And there's advice from the school, but also from DEFRA and BEIS on how to do that. There's downloadable documents you can get to check what those are. And I think I've got a sheet for that at the end as well. Basically do those conversion factors, you know, a litre of diesel equals so many kilowatt hours of energy. But you have to report both of those. You also need to report at least one intensity metric, such as productivity. You can have emissions per pound of turnover or per gross internal floor area or some other denominator that gives you a productivity and an intensity ratio to show how efficient you are with your energy. So it's tracking not only the absolute amount, but also the relative amount. To make sure that we're tracking down on both of those as much as possible. And that's to allow for where businesses grow or they take on an acquisition and their absolute emissions might jump from one year to the next because they've bought another company, for example. But as long as they can demonstrate as well that the relative emissions are tracking down, then it's still on course. Some additional requirements. You have to, where you can, provide the previous year's energy and greenhouse gas emissions and intensity figures to allow that comparison I was just alluding to, unless of course it's your first year. So you've got to be able to say, this is what we're doing this year and this is what we did last year. A bit like when you get your financial statements at year end approved by your accountants, and you'll have your columns for your financial year just gone, but also the previous 1 or 2 financial years. It's a bit like that kind of accounting, being able to see how they compare. You have to give some other qualitative information, which standard or protocol you've used to calculate your emissions, and likewise put some information, put in some pros about the actions that you're taking or plan to take, your energy efficiency measures, and you can see some of them on the screen, such as smart metering. So some of the narrative that goes around the numbers as well to kind of give credence to what you're actually doing. Reporting is annual and it's in the financial year, your financial year, starting on or after the 1st of April. So it doesn't always have to sit exactly with the kind of the UK's financial year of 1st April to 31st March. It's your financial year, but starting after the 1st of April. So if you're relevant, if you're applicable to SECA, you should be reporting already because we're 2.5 years in. It's filed with Companies House in your director's report. But interestingly, there's no obligation to audit or verify your carbon emissions or your environmental reporting. It is strongly encouraged along the lines of your other audits that you might have. You might have some quality assurance on your financial data. Very much recommend that you get the same kind of level of assurance on your carbon data as well. It's being seen as a par in terms of their importance, but there is no actual mandatory obligation to do that. There are some exceptions, a bit like CRC, but a bit easier to understand. If your energy use is less than 40 megawatt hours per year, then you can be exempt. Bear in mind that 40 megawatt hours is about the energy consumption of 3 UK households, so it's not very much. And any subsidiaries in your business that are below the qualification threshold may be exempt. This is where it differs to CRC. There was the parent company. If any of you were involved in that, there was a parent company approach that if you're part of a parent company that's involved in the CRC, you got dragged along with it because you're part of that bigger company. Streamlined energy and carbon reporting is different. If your subsidiary is below the threshold in and of itself, it can be exempt. You need to state that, and you need to provide the evidence to the relevant authorities, but you can then be exempt from that. And I've already mentioned about scope 3 being voluntary to an extent, but encouraged. And there's a link as well to the .gov.uk website. So that's SECR. That's probably the most relevant to most people. I'm going to move on now to Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme, shortened to ESOS. This one came in force about 7 years ago now as a direct consequence of the EU directive that you can see on the screen. It was already transposed into UK law, as all directives do. So with the EU exit more recently, that has stayed in place. This is one where you need to be careful because it is similar but different to SECR. Some of the things are the same, some of the things are slightly different. So be aware of the differences. Again, you're included, you're above the threshold if you're a large undertaking. 250 or more employees, the same as SECA, but the turnover threshold is different. It's driven by a 50 million euro threshold, and at the moment I think that's 44 million pounds as the turnover threshold, so slightly different, slightly higher than the one we just saw. Here, like with the CRC, but unlike the streamlined energy and carbon reporting, there is the highest parent company obligation. So if you're part of a larger organisation which meets those criteria, the highest parent, you're brought into that. They act as the highest responsible undertaking, but you're brought into it as well, so that the whole group complies. So that is a significant difference and departure from where the CRC used to be and what SCCR is now. Likewise, if you're an overseas company but they've got UK registered holdings, and again more than 250 employees, then you're involved as well, because it's a UK part of that business. Some of the things again are the same, some of them are different. The whole purpose of Energy Savings Opportunities Scheme is to identify energy savings. It kind of does what it says on the tin. It's to get those measurements, report on them, and then identify some opportunities to reduce that energy consumption, reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea is that you calculate the energy from the assets and activities that you undertake, and this is primarily, again, your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the idea is to identify significant areas of consumption. And in that assessment, you need to cover at least 90% of your consumption. So this is quite a detailed report, quite a detailed piece of work to undertake and get involvement from specialists who know how to assess energy consumption across your organisation, across your estate, and then be able to say, well, we're covering at least 90% of it, and it's all the activities that we are responsible for, and therefore we can identify any hotspots and opportunities arising from them. So you do, as part of it, you need to appoint a lead assessor to carry out your ESOS assessment. It can be someone internally, it can be someone external, but they must be an approved member of a professional body. And there's a link in the slide to take you to the place where the different approved bodies are listed in terms of who can become an ESOS, an ESOS lead assessor. What you need to do the assessment is 12 months of continuous data. And what you're doing is analysing that data for what your actual absolute energy consumption is and where those opportunities are to reduce it. And bearing in mind, it's got to be a practical implementation. It's not going to be pie in the sky in terms of what you're looking to put measures in place. So when opportunities are identified, they have to have reasonable whole life costs and benefits coming back with them to make sure that they are sensible to take forward should you wish to do so. It does involve site audit as well as of a representative sample, which will help qualify some of those pieces of information and data that you get through your assessment. In terms of submitting a report, you submit an online notification of compliance to the Environment Agency or the Environment Agency in your devolved administration, and they will store it and acknowledge that you have complied and provided that report. There's something about imposing civil sanctions and fines for non-compliance. Again, this is a bit like the CRC as it used to be. If the report is late, if the report is has got gaps in it, if it's misleading, there are civil and criminal sanctions depending on the level and severity of what's gone on. So that can be imposed at the discretion of the Environment Agency that's relevant to your situation. Excuse me. It's undertaken every 4 years. We're currently in the 3rd compliance period from December 2019 out to December 2023. And like I say, you report to the regulator in your country, and you can see those listed on the page in front of you for the 4 home nations. And making sure that you undertake that correctly and accurately to avoid the risk of fines, basically, of civil sanctions or fines for inaccurate reporting or incomplete reporting. And those are listed. If you go to the web link I give you in a bit, you can see what those are. Again, like all of these, there are certain exceptions. If your organisation is qualified to ISO 50001, the energy management standard, you automatically comply for ESOS. You still need to go through the process of saying, we have ISO 50001, we therefore comply, and this is the scope of what's included. And log that with your Environment Agency in your devolved administration or in your home country, and then you're done for that. And as you can see on the slide, there are also other bits of information that will take you part way down the road of compliance, such as display energy certificates in your buildings. Those can help you with your compliance in terms of understanding what you're doing and where your opportunities are to reduce your emissions. And there's the link. Importantly, there is no regulatory requirement to implement the opportunities. I always find this interesting. You go through the whole process of identifying your carbon footprint and looking for opportunities to reduce energy and carbon, but there's no obligation to actually follow through on any of that. I think it would be foolish to go through that process and not take on board the advice that you're given and cherry pick the ones that work best for you, but ultimately there is no obligation to do that. Okay, moving on to the voluntary reporting mechanism. First one up is CDP, formerly known as Carbon Disclosure Project. They're there to work and act as an intermediary between generally larger companies out there who want to understand what the carbon impact is of their supply chain. So they gather that information on behalf of those large corporations and analyze that data and identify the risks for carbon. They also cover off water and other aspects as well, but the focus today is on carbon and climate change. And it's looking at what the carbon impacts are, but a bit like ESOS, where the possibilities are to reduce that and what's involved in that. Again, it's scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 as well, to a large extent. This is a lot more full on, so to speak, than some of the previous ones I've been talking about. There's a lot more involved. The questionnaire is long. When I last looked, it's 183 pages. I'm sure it's moved on since then, but there's a huge amount of information that is required for this. It's not just your carbon or your energy consumption, and then a little bit of narrative about what you're doing to reduce it, what your action plan is. There you can see there in that kind of sub-bullet about governance, risks and opportunities, what your strategy is, what the initiatives are that you're taking, how you measure stuff, what standard you measure it by. There's a whole load of information that's required there to really make your case about what you're doing. This is reported on annually, and CDP review it and approve it as necessary. And they have some different approaches depending on which sector you're in. There is one for the construction sector that refines it and tailors it to the sector that we work in. But essentially, it's a long old document to fill in and provide information on what you're doing. So some of you might have had requests from your clients to do CDP. It is voluntary, supposedly, but of course, if you have a request from a client, it's a slightly different situation. There's the link. Science-based targets. Like I said a few minutes ago, we had a lunch and learn about 3 weeks ago on this. So if you'd like to learn more, go and have a look at that. I think it was the 11th of October. Maybe Sophie could pop that in the chat just to let people know. We've also got another one coming up again with Alwyn Smith in January next year, going deeper into detail about how science-based targets works and how you actually go through the process of making a target and committing and so on. Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is the kind of the organizational, the loose affiliation, is a partnership between CDP, UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and also the World Wildlife Fund. They've come together and they've got this process and methodology and approach to understand how we bring those targets down. So I've shown you that same picture again about the different emission scenarios, because that's effectively what they're working on. That is the science effectively behind science-based targets. All the information that's gone and been undertaken by the IPCC is about, well, what would happen to the Earth's climate and the temperature if we keep emitting this much carbon or this much carbon, and lots of scenarios coming out of that. And therefore, they've worked out that if we want to keep it to 1.5 degrees, we've got a certain carbon budget. So that's the science behind how we need to reduce our carbon emissions in line with that trajectory, and then we effectively get a carbon budget that comes out of that. So they've provided that methodology on how you reduce your emissions, and then it's incumbent on the applicant who wants to be aligned to science-based targets to effectively put in a baseline and say, this is where we're at now, and make a commitment within the next 5 to 15 years of how much we're going to bring that down by that is in line with the science. You have to provide, or you have to develop your own carbon reduction plan. Science-Based Targets Initiative doesn't review that or qualify it. They're looking at the baseline and the robustness of your baseline data. and then what your target is to bring that down, how much you're going to bring it down by, and by when. So, for example, we as Action Sustainability have committed to reduce our emissions by 42% by 2030 compared to a 2019 baseline, and it's that kind of process that you undertake. So again, it's your scope 1 and 2, predominantly what you can control, but importantly, if your scope 3 emissions, all those supply chain emissions, account for at least 40% or more of your overall footprint, so if you added up all your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, if scope 3 was 40% or more of that, then you have to include your scope 3 as well. And this is very important because many organizations have the predominance of their emissions in their scope 3 in their supply chain, like I mentioned earlier. One well-known buildings contractor did this kind of analysis themselves and realized that their scope 1 and 2 was only 1% of their overall footprint. 99% is in the supply chain. So they're very much in that supply chain camp for bringing down their emissions. So you develop your plan, as I say, that looks between 5 and 15 years out from when you do it, and you have to set that baseline. 2019, 2020, I think you can use 2018 as well, to measure that difference against and how much you're going to bring it down in absolute terms. What's the percentage you're going to bring that absolute baseline down by? So you get a 2-year period to go through this process with science-based targets to get your science-based target approved. So you start off by committing, you send a letter and saying, yep, we're going to commit to science-based targets. And then that's when the clock starts, and you get 24 months to work out how you're going to do it, what that target should look like. You might have several targets if you've got a complicated business, targets that apply to different parts of your business. Just as an example, SSE, the power company, has got 4 separate targets depending on their energy creation, their energy distribution and transmission businesses. So different parts of their business have got different science-based targets. Other organizations such as Network Rail have said that one of their targets is that at least 75% of their supply chain will have a science-based target. So that talks to that 40% figure. The vast majority of Network Rail's emissions are in their supply chain. All the contractors who come and build and maintain and run railways on behalf of Network Rail, that's where the emissions predominantly are. So Network Rail can influence them through procurement and so on, but to get them to have a science-based target as well is useful. So Network Rail have their own target to get their suppliers to have a science-based target within a certain time frame. So there's different ways of dealing with this. It's not just there's one target and that's it. It's different ways of slicing and dicing it up depending on your organization and how complicated it is. Once it's approved, you provide an annual report, because effectively what science-based targets want to do when you've committed and submitted and then have been approved for your science-based target, that you go back on an annual basis and say, this is where we're at. We've redone our footprint and we can see that we were here when we first submitted and we're now here. We're on trajectory. And the idea is that you follow every year with a follow-up carbon footprint of how you're doing, and you're tracking down that trajectory that you agreed with science-based targets at the beginning. And it's following that 1.5 degree line that I showed you in the previous graph to reach your goal, basically. Okay, last but not least, the Supply Chain Schools Climate Action Group. This is another reporting mechanism. Again, it's voluntary, but it's something that's set up with the Supply Chain School by the partners to get suppliers and contractors to report into an online tool, and it has various uses. So from the supplier's point of view, the subcontractor's point of view, you get to build your carbon footprint. It's an online tool, you get to plug in your data, it does the maths for you, and you get an understanding of what your scope 1, 2 emissions are and your scope 3 where relevant. And it allows you to identify hotspots. Like any tool, you can say, well, we consume a lot of energy and produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in our transport fleet or in our depots or wherever it might be, and that's maybe where we need to take action, where we need to focus on, and that should lead to real savings and opportunities that can come out of this. How it works, as I say, it's a free online tool that's available through the Supply Chain School. If you're a member of the school and you supply to one of the partners, it's there. It's got the functionality in there to calculate your carbon emissions, but importantly, one of the differences to many other tools is it has something called apportionment. This is where you as a supplier go in and say, I use this much electricity, this many litres of diesel, this much petrol, this much mileage, so on, stick in your numbers and you get your footprint for what you do. The apportionment bit is to then say, well, I do that work on behalf of all my different customers. And there's a drop-down menu in the tool that says you can choose which of your customers that you supply to, and you can attribute an apportionment, you can apportion some of your revenue to that. let's say for sake of argument, you do 5% of your business with Morgan Sindall, 3% with Kia, 10% with Costain. You can attribute it that way. We understand there's an inherent risk of a little bit of inaccuracy there, but it's a good way of very rapidly apportioning that data, your data, up to your customers, partners in the supply chain school. So you get to do a good thing with your customers, and your partners get to see, your customers get to see what their Scope 3 supply chain footprint looks like. The other benefit, of course, is if you're a supplier, you do this once a year, and then you apportion it up to your suppliers rather than answering lots of very similar different questionnaires for different customers. So it's trying to reduce that reporting burden as well on the supply chain. There's two types of report. If you're an organization that's relatively small and relatively new to this, it takes you through step by step, gives you the guidance, and you plug in all your activity data, which means your litres of diesel, your kilowatt hours of electric. If you're more advanced and you're already reporting to SECA, for example, you can kind of skip to the end and just put in your answer. You can say, well, my Scope 1 emissions are that many tons of carbon dioxide. You don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of plugging in all your kilowatts and your kilos and your litres. You can kind of go to the end and just put in the final figure. As I mentioned, it's annual reporting, but you can report more frequently. The tool allows very frequent reporting, but the basic minimum we want is annual reporting, because essentially here we're looking at getting organizational level footprinting. This is not about a project level or a package or a particular service for just one client. It's about your overall organization and what it emits in a given 12-month period. And then that carved up in a portion to your clients. And from that, you know what the kind of exposure you have to greenhouse gas emissions as your organization. And then, like all online tools, there's lots of great dashboards and visualization and icons to help look through what the data is, graphical outputs and so on. So it's all very accessible in that respect. We've also developed lots of learning guidance to go with that, various videos, downloadable PDF documents to take you through the process of how you do that. And aligned to that, we have a series of webinars that people are welcome to join ad hoc to understand more about the tool and get a live demo from the tool. So between the kind of virtual webinars and the downloadable documents and the tool itself, there's a lot of opportunity to get involved and report. And as I said, it's free. This is just a brief screen grab of what the tool looks like. It's fairly intuitive. How much diesel do you use? Stick in the litres. How much HVO do you use? Stick in the litres. I just noted an error. It's not hydrogenated, it's hydro-treated vegetable oil. I'll go and speak to someone about that. But it's really intuitive, as long as you've got access to that data. And that's where it takes on to the next point. Where do we get that data from? Because it's all very well understanding what these reporting mechanisms are and how we feed into them, and we understand what scopes 1, 2, and 3 are. But if we can't get the data, or we don't know where to get it from, we're a bit stuck. So various sources of carbon emissions from your organization. And this tallies in with what we were talking about earlier with scope 1, 2, and 3. So there's your own business, and you can see the various sources from that, whether it's your buildings, your plant, your HVAC, and so on. There's your suppliers, all those scope 3 buckets, the materials, the capital goods, and so on. Business travel, water, and waste. But then also your downstream piece as well, your clients. So a good example here is in the housing sector. If you're a house builder and you sit in the middle as your business, your emissions might only be 1 or 2% of the overall picture. Your supply chain might account for about 2/3 of your overall footprint, all those bricks and blocks and timber and tiles and so on that go into building a house. And then your client, the householder, is the other third of that. So understanding how that apportions out is really important as well, understanding where that data is. A bit of jargon. Some of the upstream stuff that's in your supply chain is sometimes called embodied carbon or capital carbon if you're in the infrastructure sector. If it's your business, it's operational carbon. That should be fairly self-explanatory. And then the end user carbon could be your client, someone who's bought or commissioned something from you, and they're using that carbon. But it's incumbent on you as the manufacturer or the supplier, because in this sense, you're the supplier to your client. You see the supplier piece just moves down and the client piece just moves down. That they're the end user, and understanding what you can do to help them is important. In the way that you'd ask your supplier what they can do to help you, that conversation should go all the way up and then all the way back down. In terms of your boundaries, the one in red there is essentially your scope 1 emissions that we've talked about, what you'll have to report to SECA and to ESOS, SBTI, CDP as well. your electricity, definitely your grid electric, your business travel will be in that. And then it gets into the slightly harder, but by no means unachievable part of your materials and goods and other services that you procure from your supply chain. Many sources of data. I could only fit 6 around that hexagon for obvious reasons. There are going to be other sources of data out there where you might go and get your information, and it will look like this. You'll be asking people for activity data. You'll be looking for litres of diesel, mileage travelled, tonnes or metre cubed of materials. And it's these kinds of parts of your business that will have, or outside of your business indeed, that will have that information. So the thing I often say to people is, if you're going to do carbon reporting, it's not only understanding the jargon of scope 1, 2 and 3 or consolidation approaches and all the stuff I talked about yesterday. It's about having the right relationships with the right people in your own organization and in other organizations, because they'll have that data in some shape or form. And being able to get good, robust, accurate data is really important if you're going to submit an accurate report to government through your director's report or through ESOS, for example. And because of that, when we say good data, these are some of the things we need to think about. Where does that data come from? Is it real data that's been metered or measured somehow? Or is it some kind of proxy data where you've taken a price and you get a kind of a unit value per ton or per meter cube? There's different ways of doing this, and not all data is easily available. You might get it in some weird imperial measures if you import from the US as well. I've had to deal with pecks and bushels in the past, and thankfully we have Google these days to convert a peck and a bushel into a ton. But there's some stuff out there that you need to be aware of, that it might not come nice and neatly packaged up in litres or something that's easily convertible. And then on furthermore on the robustness piece, do look at it like you would any piece of information. Don't always just implicitly trust what you're given in terms of, this is what we consumed. Think about how relevant it is to your situation. Is it from the same sector as you, basically, because you could get it from a different sector or a different geography. It could be from a different time period. It could be out of date, basically. Is it from an organization that you would say is reliable and trustworthy, or have they got a bias to push forward in some, trying to put some kind of marketing angle on it? And also think about the time that you have available to gather this data. It is a bit of an 80-20 rule to some extent, but providing the right kind of resources to make this work is really important. A good example of this was I was doing a piece of work for one client, and they wanted to know transport data from logistics, and we thought we could use fuel cards. The driver's given fuel cards to pay for the diesel when they top up. They're meant to give an indication off their odometer how far they've travelled, and use that data to see how far they're going and what their fuel efficiency is. The data was rubbish. People just wouldn't give their mileage reading, or if they did, it was a random number. So the way we had to revert there was, rather than using the supposedly mileage data that came out of that data export, we went to the actual spend, the spend on the fuel, because we knew that that was accurate. Money is pretty much always accurate. And then working back from there, using a unit price of diesel to say, well, that means it's so many litres of diesel consumed. So always think about data accuracy, because you might get a wildly different answer than you were expecting. I mentioned in some of the explanation for SECA and ESOS and CDP that they talk about different protocols and standards. There's an ISO standard 14064 for measuring your greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of organizations use the greenhouse gas protocol. It gives you lots of guidance on how you go about setting your boundaries. It's a really in-depth document, but a really good and easy read, all things considered, and it gives you that information on how you set your scope, what your consolidation approach is that I was talking about yesterday, if you were on that call, whether it's your operational or your financial or your equity. Really useful to have that as the cornerstone of what you're doing. Then you know that you're playing by the rules and you're doing it properly, so to speak. I mentioned some resources. Don't worry about trying to read this now, but when you get the PDF of the slides, this will be in there. This provides a lot of the information for you, a lot of those conversion factors to help you calculate and assess what you're doing. And I'll just bring your attention to the top two. The one from DEFRA, which is updated annually. It's available to download for free as an Excel file, a large Excel file, chock full of information and conversion factors to convert your litre of diesel to an emission of carbon, greenhouse gases. And then similarly, the Bath Inventory of Carbon and Energy, the Bath ICE database, provides a lot of information about the embodied carbon of all those materials that are consumed, very much focused on the construction sector. And that's drawn from a whole range of different data sources. But one thing I just want to say as well, that this is more than just reporting data for data's sake. It really is the starting point in my mind for understanding, well, how can we reduce our emissions? And that's what ESOS is trying to get at, and some of the others as well, is particularly SBTI. Having that baseline, having that information, whether you're being driven to it by legislation through SECA, or whether you're being asked to do it by your clients through CDP, it's all for good reasons. It's not just reporting. So when you're kind of in the mire, in the depths of doing that reporting and cursing your client's name or the government, just think about actually the benefit that comes out of this is being able to identify those opportunities. Where can we go and make some savings financially, carbon, and other impacts as well? Let's not forget that climate change is linked to air quality as well through the combustion of fossil fuels, or the consumption of materials and circular economy, and all the resource efficiency we can think about as well. Biodiversity as well, if we're looking at natural products in particular. The COP26 only yesterday or the day before agreed to halt deforestation by 2030. So yeah, very much high on the agenda as well. It's not just about burning dead dinosaurs. Okay, so that's where I'm going to pause for the moment. I think by my clock, I've got a few minutes left. If you're needing to go off to another meeting, thank you very much for your attendance. You're free to go. As I say, we'll be sharing the slides and the recording afterwards. The link to the feedback, I think, is in the chat box, as is the science-based targets information that Sophie's popped in there. So thank you for your attendance. If you want to hang on while I try and answer some of the questions that we've got, then I will do that as well. So let me just stop sharing for a moment. Okay. So question from Marsha, is the water supply to our building not part of our scope 2? So water is a service provided in the same way that electricity is, or waste, but only electricity and energy provision is in your scope 2. So scope 2 actually covers the electricity when you plug things in, but also if you buy heat or steam off a third party, some production processes require steam. So quite often paper mills, for example, will sell excess heat and steam from their process to somebody else. That would be scope 2 if you bought that. But water falls in your scope 3 as the same as waste does, because they've provided that service on your behalf. Could I give an example of what gives out 1 ton of carbon dioxide? Very good question from Mike. I recognize your name, Mike. You've been on a few of these before. So great resource there from Chris. Thank you for that. If I remember rightly, 250 litres of diesel gives about 700 kilos of carbon. So if you scale up 700 kilos, you've got to times it by 1.5. So times 250 by 1.5, and you're getting about 380 litres of diesel. Is about a ton of carbon dioxide. Do check my maths on that, but something like 300 to 400 litres of diesel is about a ton of carbon dioxide. There's a great graphic if you search online of an NGO that had it's a bit of a publicity stunt, but a very good one. They got this massive balloon somewhere in Germany, this massive big blue balloon, and they filled it with a ton of carbon dioxide, and it was huge. And I think it was at atmospheric pressure. They didn't condense it or anything. It was just at atmospheric pressure. And it was kind of 4 or 5 times the height of an adult. It's pretty big. But for me, it's always about converting it into things like, well, what's the equivalent in terms of miles traveled by a vehicle, or how many flights to and from London to New York, for example. So the example I often use in some of my other stuff is that there's a case study I've got where they calculated that a saving could be 33,000 tons of CO2 between 2 different options, 33,000 tons of CO2, and that equated to about the energy consumed for 1,000 UK homes for a year. So you can do the maths on that. A UK home uses or emits about just over 3 tons of carbon dioxide per year from the electricity and gas that we all use in our houses. Cool. So question from Niall, is there any coverage from the school on dual reporting in situations where a company purchases renewable energy? Yes, so in the carbon tool, the carbon calculator that the school has got, there is an option to report your location and your market-based emissions. So just for a bit of an explanation on that, there's a grid emission factor that we all have. There's a national grid. You plug something in, you use the electricity. There's an emission factor for that, which is an average across all the energy mix that we have, whether it's gas-fired, whether it's nuclear, whether it's renewable. biomass or whatever, and that's an average. But you can also, as an organisation, purchase, they're often called green tariffs, or you can use a power purchase agreement, and you can get a different conversion factor for your energy because it's less carbon intensive. In the carbon tool that we're doing through the supply chain school, you can report both, and in SECR you have to report. You have to report the location-based emission, which is the grid, which is currently 0.22 kilos per kilowatt hour. But you can also report the market-based one. So if you have a green tariff, that's the market-based one. You can report both. So, question from Kevin: can the Climate Action Group online tool be used to calculate emissions for SECA? Yes, we've looked at that and how we've basically aligned it in terms of its scope 1, and there's options for scope 3. So yes. Is it possible to change from monthly reporting to annual reporting on the free supplier carbon calculator? Yeah, essentially you can choose. As I say, annual is the de minimis because we want annual organizational footprinting, but we are also minded that some organizations like to report more frequently, because then you get into a bit of a habit of it and you get used to it and you do it monthly or quarterly, rather than going at the 11th month thinking, how did we do it last year? What was our process? We found that with other clients who report into the tool. So it's up to you, but we do recommend a bit more frequently than annual if possible. Okay. 1% for that contractor scope 1 and 2 emissions is interesting. Is it the case that for most contractor developer organizations, scope 3 is the largest proportion? Generally, yes. In the construction sector, generally, yes. It might not be as low as 1%, but generally, yes. So I gave you the contractor, I gave you the housing developer as well, that they're in a similar situation in terms of that scope 1, 2 versus scope 3. Another example I've got is from an estates organization. It's a university. And in their case, their scope 1 and 2 accounted for about a quarter of their emissions, about 25%. So that's where they consume greenhouse gases themselves. Sorry, they emit GHG themselves through the combustion of fossil fuels and the use of electricity. The other 3/4 was largely their supply chain. So that was commuting, it was travel from students going to and from home, it was other releases as well. But a big chunk of that 3/4, 2/3 of that 3/4 was from procurement. It was from the supply and purchase of laboratory materials, food and catering, ICT, construction products for building new campus buildings, that kind of stuff. So yes, it's very significant. The time where it's normally less significant is if you get a power company. For obvious reasons, the flip is the other way. Most of their emissions are in scope 1 because they're the ones providing the power to everybody else. To Derek's question, if you've been using the tool, I'd get in contact with Steph at actionsustainability.com about doing any amendments. That's probably the easiest way, rather than me kind of talking that through to you on this call. Justin, have I ever heard of the Green Dragon Environmental Standard? I haven't, I'm afraid, but I'd like to know more. That sounds like it would be good, but I can imagine what it would be like. It'd make good TV. Okay, so from Anonymous, it's moving around a bit. There's something about what are the legal penalties for not providing any of these plans, information and reporting? So with ESOS, as I was saying, if you don't meet the deadline, there's a penalty. If it's inaccurate, or they perceive it to be inaccurate, or there's gaps missing, there's a penalty. If they can identify that there's been willful inaccuracy and it's not just accidental accuracy, then the penalties can change. They can go from civil and ultimately they can become criminal. With SECA, you have to report that as well. There's part of that in there. I'm not sure that there's actual fines in that, but there's definitely a follow-up from that. So Arif has got a question here. What are the requirements for an SME? Generally speaking, SMEs fall below the threshold for SECA and ESOS. As I was outlining earlier, the thresholds are more than 250 employees, which is the same as the EU's definition of what an SME is for employee numbers. And there's the turnover targets as well, whether it's 36 million for SECA or 44 million pounds for ESOS. So generally, SMEs fall below, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be reporting anyway. It makes good practice. As I say, we're as Action Sustainability, we're an SME, we are 30 people. We did our own baseline on a lot of things, and that included our office use and on our commuting, our business travel to go and give supply chain school events and other bits and bobs as well. worked out what our baseline was. And through that, we've been able to submit to science-based targets and get an approved route into that. In terms of science-based targets themselves, there is a kind of a shortcut route for SMEs that came out very recently, and that kind of makes the process a lot much And in their world, an SME is less than 500 employees. So that's an interesting piece. Done with that one. If I use a supply chain school carbon reporting tool, is it visible to clients? Yes, definitely. This is one of the key parts of it. So if when we think of clients, it could be a Morgan Sindall, a Costain, a Canary Wharf Group, Highways UK. The idea is that you as a supplier plug in your data for your annual organizational footprint. You crank the handle, the maths is done, you apportion it, you know, as I said, 2% here, 5% there, depending on your revenue. The best way of doing that is, or the easiest way of doing that everybody's accepted. As your client, I would look into my portal and say, I've been apportioned so many tons of carbon from supplier X. So they will see the absolute tons of carbon in their supply chain scope 3 footprint, and they'll see that it's come from you. What they won't see is what proportion of your total footprint that makes. They won't see that 10 tons of carbon equates to 10% or 50% or whatever. They won't see that because there's going to be there could be a tension there in terms of understanding how much of your business that they account for, how much they account for your business. So it's basically just on absolute terms. But yes, they see that, and they would look through their supply chain and go, well, we have all these suppliers, they've all apportioned us so much, and you add it up and they can say, well, yes, this is a contribution to our scope 3 footprint. Final question from Paul. We are accredited to the Achilles Carbon Reduction Scheme known as CMARS. How does this compare to CDP? Yeah, CMARS is another route to reporting. It's linked to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and it's very much focused on the construction sector in terms of gathering that data and providing your carbon footprint. I don't know, if I'm being honest, how it directly correlates, but I'm sure that it will be there'll be a lot of read across because you're gathering your scope 1, 2 and some of your scope 3 data. So there'll be a lot of read across there. What will be different though is all the other stuff that I mentioned in CDP, where it talks about your policy strategy, all those kinds of things as well. What other information you need to provide, as well as the data that goes with it. So it would be worth looking at that part, if not the data side of things. Okay, I'm going to pause there because we're over the hour. Thank you very much for your time, for those of you who are still listening. I hope you found it useful. As I said, my colleague Sophie will be circulating the slides and the recording as well. We've got one more of these sessions tomorrow on net zero and offsetting, the 4th and final instalment, same time, same channel tomorrow. Do come along if you can, but if not, have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.